General Account Policy and Air Policy, Air Save tab, and then Negotiated Air Discounts. So we're going to start with the General Account Policy tab. So we click on Office Setup, and when it asks us for the sudo, we've got to use the same sudo that we're 888 into. So I'll be using 08 Whiskey Alpha during this demonstration. That's my test sudo, and that's where I'm emulated right now. So we type that in, we click OK, and it displays the General Office Policy tab. So in account setup, it would be General Account Policy, but I'm doing this demonstration in Office setup, which is what the majority of the people on Res1 Plus probably are configured for. So you can see the structure of the format that you use to call that. It's display-08WA, so that's the sudo that the profile is in. ROP is the first level profile. Anybody who's set up an ROP is going to have an end display ROP, and it's just basically a shell that has that one line here that says this is a Res1 Plus account file. So that tells Res1 Plus that the sudo actually has already set up something in Res1 Plus. And if you're looking at the Office setup profile, it's always going to be the word Office. And if it's the account setup profile, it's always going to be the word that is equal to the after the dash and before the slash in your B cross remark. So it would say Peter in this case. But again, we're going to work in Office setup for the purposes of this demonstration. So on the General Office Policy tab, you have your booking sudo, and that is basically always going to be the same sudo that your profile is in. So if you have your ROP set up in one sudo, that's where all your settings are. If you're working out of a different sudo on your PNRs, that's fine as long as your PNRs have that B cross remark that says Peter/08WA. But don't mistake this for it's okay to put in any booking sudo here. If you're working out of a different sudo like XYZ, you can't put XYZ here. This is actually looking for where your Office profile is set up. So it's going to be 08WA. Same sudo that we're emulated in. Same sudo that we entered when ROP Office Setup was launched. Okay, so this Office is on TIM standards. We just want to select that all the time. That just makes sure that ROP is expecting certain formats to be in a certain style, and it adheres to TIM standards. Where you might run into issues with that is if you have a passenger profile that was created online, there might be a particular element where they didn't follow the TIM standards. For example, if it's looking for a date in a certain remark and ROP is looking for it as the month, year, and then in an online profile they do month, day, year, or even worse, month, day, year, ROP is going to have trouble reading that. So really the important thing to realize here is just make sure that this is always selected. To display the last 5 previous emails sent in my travel plans, that is basically just something where when you run document delivery, if you have this selected, it'll actually display not only the email addresses that it finds in the PNR, but it'll also remember up to the 5 previous emails that you had used when you went through document delivery previously in the session of ROP that you're running. Store fare using PQ. This is basically something that's been there ever since Sabre changed their pricing system and started using the PQ formats. This was necessary during the transition because not everybody moved at the same time to the PQ formats. However, today you just want to not touch that. It should be checked by default, and you should never uncheck it. Print mini itinerary for all paper tickets. Again, we're in an e-ticket universe these days. I don't see any reason to have that checked at this time. Append reason code to all car overrides. Basically today, the GBT standard is like when you book a hotel and you have to add an override. That override will have a reason code attached to it. But the requirement for cars is not the same. Not everybody requires a reason code. So basically what this is if your specific account or office does require a reason code, you want to select this. That way ROP knows that when you're adding an override, it needs to prompt you for a reason code and let you know if you forgot to add it. The next piece here is this office uses which QC product. This is actually condensed, but for infrastructure reasons, we couldn't just simply assume that everybody's on CoreX. There would have been some major complications with just making that assumption. So for today, just keep in mind that anybody using ROP, it's assumed that they're also using CoreX. So this CoreX and or AIM needs to be selected. If you don't select this, it's basically going to affect some of the formats it uses throughout documenting the PNR. Most notably, when you're adding a TAW, CoreX expects the TAW line to be in a certain format, so it'll adhere to that. It'll also take into account your booking pseudo and I believe a queue number at certain parts in Res1 Plus. So as long as you just keep this selected, it'll always format the TAW line in the right configuration. The queue information basically is your CoreX queue. So typically your CoreX queue for offline is set up with your booking pseudo Q88 prefatory code 11. So you may have, some individual exceptions, but this is basically where whenever you're queuing something to CoreX, it's going to go here. So if you have some sort of unique situation where you don't use this standard queue, this is where you would change it. And then use auto ticketing, hopefully everybody does. You would want this checked. And that just makes sure that when you're storing the fare and documenting the PNR, ROP is doing all the formats in the right configuration. So that's it for the General Office Policy tab. There should be no reason that you would want to modify any of these settings. These are all just mostly standard configurations that haven't changed in a long time. The next tab that I'm going to go over is the Air Policy tab. This Air Policy tab actually has 3 sub-tabs. There's an Air Save Codes tab, where you basically have your lowest logical airfare reason codes set up, both whichever standard ones you would use if you use any of the standard codes, plus any custom air savings code that your account or your office requires. At the bottom is the LLA code. And what this is a newer feature of Res1 Plus. This came along as a part of the After Call Work project where they were looking for shortcuts where things that were pretty common in your workflow where you could have ROP assume certain things just to save a few seconds and a few mouse clicks or keystrokes. And what this one is, it's basically saying that if your stored fare is the same as the low fare that's documented in the store fare routine when you get to the very end of the store fare routine, it's going to say if that's the same, then you've got the lowest logical airfare. And Res1 Plus just needs to know what code do you use when the lowest logical airfare is actually booked, so you don't have to select it every time you get to that screen in store fare. It'll just add it for you. So this basically says what is your low fare code that you would use if you do have the lowest fare booked. So in this case, LL. So at the end of the store fare routine, when you select your reason code, if it sees the stored fare matches the lowest logical airfare amount, it'll just pre-fill LL. So you don't have to click on that from the drop-down list. Standard codes, so GBT standards use this list of codes. Whichever ones you also use, you just leave them checked. Let's say that you have a customer that doesn't use specific ones from the standard list. You can uncheck them so that they don't even appear in the drop-down list when the TC needs to select a reason code. Why list stuff that they would never use? So that's your opportunity to uncheck it. Also, you have the opportunity to do custom air savings codes on this tab. Here, let's say there's a code, let's just say PS, and we're going to call it whatever. So whenever a certain situation relates to the fare that you've got booked. Let's say that it's a special fare that was just put in place for a particular event. So none of the standard air codes you use would apply. So you would enter just a description like 2016 convention fare or something like that. Whatever the code is, whatever you want to call it, and then a loss indicator. So with the loss indicator, you have three choices. You have must-have loss, cannot have loss, and neither. And the significance of this is that you can optionally add some validation to Res1 Plus, where when you select a particular lowest logical airfare, you can specify whether that code applies to when you do have the lowest logical airfare or when you don't, or if you don't want Res1 Plus to validate it. So the significance of that is if you say must have loss, that means that whenever you use this code, the lowest logical airfare has to be less than the stored fare. It's basically saying this code represents when you didn't take the lowest logical airfare, so you better have a higher fare. Otherwise, you're using the wrong code. So let's say that your stored fare and your lowest logical airfare are the same, and then you pick this particular code, PS, Res1 Plus will say, hey, you can't do that. The fares can't be the same. So on the flip side, let's say that PS did represent a situation where you did take the lowest logical airfare. So the PQ fare has to be equal to the lowest logical airfare amount that you specified. So you select it and it doesn't match. Let's say you have a higher fare stored than what you documented. Because you called it cannot have loss, basically ROP is going to say, hey, wait a minute, something's wrong here. You can't have a low fare amount that's lower than the stored fare. It has to be the same. Neither basically means sometimes your stored fare will equal the lowest logical airfare, but not always. So the fare may or may not be equal. So we basically don't want Res1 Plus to question what you put. So if you have neither as your loss indicator, then whenever you use the code PS, ROP is not going to question the validity of that code with one important exception. And that is basically that there has existed a GBT standard that ROP has followed. And I know that individual accounts have questioned this, so I'll just kind of go over it hopefully briefly so that it makes a little more sense. If you think of the LLA in terms of what it is, it's the lowest logical airfare. So let's say that the lowest logical airfare is $250. So that's the lowest that the airfare can logically be. And let's say that you've stored a $250 fare, but you want to say that the lowest logical airfare is $300. Now that doesn't make sense because you're basically saying the lowest airfare I can possibly have is $300 when in fact I'm trying to say that my fare is even lower than that. So logically that just does not make sense. So Res1 Plus will not allow you to set up your low fare savings code in such a way that you can have a situation where the stored fare is lower than the lowest possible airfare. The one exception to that is if you explicitly tell Res1 Plus that you're doing an exchange. So on that, when you're going through store fare, Res1 Plus asks you if you're doing an exchange. And if you say yes, it's going to, put you through the exchange mask stuff. And then when it gets to the end, it's going to know, well, I'm doing an exchange, so I'm not going to perform this validation. A couple of people have come to me questioning why they can't have Res1 Plus do that. And my response is basically, the important thing is that if your customer has parameters where they want this sort of logic in place, they can certainly have it, but there's no reason it has to be in the LDASH. So right now, this is such a rare occurrence that the best way to manage such a situation would be through your MI data. So let's say that you want to be able to document an amount that basically ROP is not going to allow in the LDASH. Just set up your reporting system to use one of the other MI fields, a UDID, a government, or a sort. And in most cases, if you set it up correctly, you absolutely have no problems reporting that data to the customer the way they need it. So that's all I'm going to say about that in the context of this demonstration. So the last thing you do on AirSave Codes tab, when you're putting in custom codes, you type in the code, the description, and the loss indicator, and then you click Add Save Code. And it'll show up with a checkbox selected, so that when you click on Save, it'll actually rebuild the profile, including the changes you've made. So if you've unchecked anything at the top, it'll note that in the profile, saying, okay, I'm no longer using FR, but now I'm going to use a PS. And the reason that we have two separate lists here is standard AirSave codes are actually standard across all of GBT. So there's a certain file with certain universal or standard configurations that everybody has that never changes. So it's stored in a file that allows you more room to just put the customized stuff in your GDS profile, because your GDS profile only allows 200 lines. So hopefully at some point in the future we'll migrate to databases to store this data. That is an initiative that is ongoing. Hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later. But at that point, the significance of that would be we'd have more options. Right now we're constrained to the 200 lines of a Sabre Star. So when you go through all these tabs, you're filling up that profile pretty quickly. So in this case, with the AirSave codes, it'll let you add up to 10 codes. And basically, if you go beyond that, it will alert you. Let's say you add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every time you click add, it'll populate this screen. But if you try to add too many, when you click on add, it'll say, hey, wait a minute, you don't have room for any more. And then let's say that you go back and you realize there's a typo or something's wrong and you want to redo it, or you don't want to use the code after all you have to do is deselect it. And again, when you're done with all your changes, you can click Save, or you can go on to your other tabs and make further changes to other tabs, and then go back at the end and save it. And so when you click on Save, it actually deletes the current profile, or it deletes the contents of the profile, and then it rebuilds it from scratch. It puts every single line of data, whether you just added it or if it was still there from before. It just rebuilds it line by line, and everything goes on a certain line. And as long as the construction of that profile isn't corrupted, you should be able to manage it completely through Office or account setup. So that is it for the AirSave Codes tab. I'll just mention that there's also a low fare options tab where we have a lot of detail in that. So we're going to come back to that one a little bit later. I'm going to actually go to a different tab first. But before I do that, I'll also point out the Dakota Savings tab just to tell you that this is obsolete. Everything is deactivated here. We do not currently use the functionality here. So it's all grayed out and you can't go in there and make any sort of configuration modifications or anything. So right now I am going to go to the Negotiated Air Discounts tab. This one has a lot of little detail in it. Hopefully I'll be able to clearly communicate the important information here. This could actually determine your risk to getting debit memos or preventing debit memos based on your understanding of how SNAP codes and negotiated contracts work. Basically, we have a capacity for 10 tabs. Each contract that you have will use at least 4 or 5 lines. So let's say you have 20 contracts. If you were to use 20 contracts and you had 5 lines per contract, you're already using 100 lines out of 200 of your profile. So it's simply not feasible to fit 20 or 30 contracts in a star because it just won't fit, and then you won't have any room for anything else. So when RES1 Plus was designed for this functionality, it basically, maybe you could call it the 80-20 rule. Most accounts or most offices probably won't have more than 10. So today we know for a fact that there's people that have almost 30. So how do you fit 30 contracts into 10 tabs? I'll show you, hopefully. So 1017 I just used it as an example because over the years I guess it was just a common snap code for middle market. So I have that in here. But middle market accounts might have a 1017 snap code, and they might also have one that's specific to their business. So let's say that their snap code is AMX12. Before we had what's called ATPCO, which is a system that allows the airlines to put your contracted information into the GDS as opposed to you going into the GDS and doing it yourself or through PRDS. It's actually coming from the carrier to the GDS instead of from GBT to the GDS. And the benefit of that is when the carrier files it through the GDS, all you really need to do is have the snap code. Whereas if the carrier doesn't file it through ATPCO into the GDS, then you might have to provide a snap code and a tour code or IT number or some endorsements that your airline contract says whenever you use this snap code, you must also add this other documentation. So in those days, you would have had an American contract, for example, and you would have called it whatever, a neg or something that your TCs would understand to identify that specific contract. And then you would select your validating carrier. You'd put in your snap code. You'd probably have a tour code in there somewhere, especially if you were had a contract with American. I know that they were famous for having like a really long one. And then your endorsements. So you would do your traditional shortcuts for, non-refundable or refund agent only, exchange only. Sabre only allows so much room, so a lot of times you'd have to abbreviate. So you'd have your snap code and your tour code and your endorsements. You would also have an OSI, but these days it seems to be more feasible to not use the needs OSI option, because you can put your OSIs in your company level profile, so they're going to be in every single P&R that you create, and those OSIs are only sent to the carriers that you're actually being in your itinerary. So if you have an American P&R and you use this American contract and you have an OSI, it's going to send it to American. But if it's a Delta P&R, it's not going to hurt that that OSI is in the P&R. It's just not going to send a United OSI to American or an American OSI to United. So it doesn't hurt to just put them all in your company level profile and don't even have Res 1 Plus worry about it. It's just less configuration to worry about, even a time saver, probably a thousandth of a second, by not having to add additional data into a format when it's pricing it. But in any case, if we have it set up this way, which is how it was before the days of ATPCO, we have to basically use one contract per tab, or one tab per contract, I guess would be more accurate. So we'd have our American, we'd have our Delta, we'd have our United, and in each case, they had snap codes that were all the same, AMX12. And let's say that Delta wanted you to put valid Delta only in the endorsement. So you've got 3 different carriers with 3 different requirements. American wants you to put a tour code and an endorsement. Delta wants you to put an endorsement. United just wants the snap code. So back in the day, you had no choice. You had to do separate tabs for each carrier because their documentation requirements were different, even though all 3 of these carriers have the same snap code, AMX12. So with ATPCO and the CAT 25 fares, today American goes to Sabre and says, okay, when GBT uses a snap code of AMX12 for one of our bookings in Sabre, just assume that they're using this IT number and this endorsement. Delta does the same thing. They go to Sabre and they say, whenever GBT uses AMX12, when we store the fare in Sabre, we're going to include this endorsement. And United, they'll go to Sabre and they'll say, when GBT uses AMX12, we don't need a tour code or an endorsement. So the big thing here is the fact that for all three of these carriers today, through the magic of ATPCO, we should only have to put the snap code for all three. So we have American snap code AMX12, we have Delta AMX12, we have United AMX12. And then let's not forget 1017, we've got one that's different. So now we have 4 tabs used up and we've got 26 to go. Let's say that those other 26 contracts all have the same thing in common. They all have AMX12 and they're all filed through ATPCO by the carrier in Sabre. So what we can do is say, well, I don't need to put this in 29 times. I'm going to just put it in once under whatever you want to call it. And we're going to change the carrier code to XX or YY. I think YY is what I'm used to. But basically that's your signal that this contract is going to apply to more than one carrier. So now when you're storing your fare in Res1 Plus, it doesn't matter if it's Delta or American or United. You just know that it's one of the many carriers that you have contracts with that use that same snap code. So basically what's going to happen is you get to the point where it prompts you for the fare and you say, I'm going to use a negotiated fare and I'm going to use the AMX12 snap code. It's going to compare the carrier that's booked in your itinerary for each segment, and it's going to see that the carrier for this contract is YY, and it's going to say, well, they don't match. There is no, I don't see a YY segment in there. It's American or it's Delta or it's United. It doesn't match. So are you sure this is correct? All you do is say, yes, it's correct. So go on. It'll just store the fare normally. You don't have to pick the individual carrier from the drop-down list of carriers when you're storing the fare and you're choosing your negotiated contract. You're basically saying, I'm using either my common middle market discount code or the snap code that I have for my specific customers. Let's say that out of those 26 carriers, one of them, for whatever reason, doesn't file it through ATPCO. Let's say that Northwest didn't file it through ATPCO. Obviously, Northwest doesn't exist anymore, so I haven't offended any current airlines, I guess. That's good. They have the same snap code, and I say valid Northwest only. They didn't go through ATPCO, so they're saying, no, you have to put snap code AMX12, and you have to add the endorsement. So that is how we would do it. We would say, okay, now we have 3 tabs. We have 1017 for the middle market. We have all our ATPCO filed contracts where all we need is the snap code. And then even though this one carrier has the same snap code, they want us to add an endorsement. And if we don't, we're going to get a debit memo. So instead of 30 different tabs, you now have 3. Now, another point on this one. Let's say you do have a carrier that you have a snap code for, and they're telling you that you have to file an endorsement. We need to push back on that. And what my recommendation is to open a ticket through Salesforce for the PRDS to go to the carrier and say, hey, we need you to file this through the GDS the right way. Even though you're booking another carrier here, the snap code is the same. We should be able to just use the snap code. And the carrier has the responsibility of making sure that if there's an IT number, a tour code, or an endorsement, that it's filed through the GDS so you don't have to worry about it. And the significance of that, very important here, because a little bit earlier I mentioned debit memos. In the old days, if they said you have to put valid NW only, and let's say that when you put it in ROP, you had a bad day and you typed it wrong and you put valid N only. Being the kind, understanding corporations that they are, they'll say, oh, that's a debit memo. You typed it in wrong, and you are on the hook for that debit memo. If you're going to get out of it, you're going to have to fight for it. If they file it correctly through ATPCO, no problem. If you file it correctly through ATPCO, no problem. But if you don't use the correct information, you're on the hook for a debit memo. Because let's say that the carrier, one of these other carriers, had a typo where whatever their carrier code was and they filed it wrong. They put it through the GDS, not you. So it's their mistake. You're not going to get a debit memo. But let's say, for example, that you're booking Delta and they want valid Delta only, and that's how they file it through ATPCO. Let's say that you've had this contract for 15 years, way before this functionality existed, and you've never had to change it. So Delta comes along and your snap code's never changed, but now Delta files something different. Now they want valid Delta only spelled out, and you may think no big deal, it's filed through ATPCO, and they change it, but you don't have to worry about it. Well, if you had something here at some point, let's say you had valid DL only, when Delta has changed it to valid DELTA only, now when you store the fare and you have this endorsement here, even though you don't need it, if this is incorrect, you're going to get a debit memo, because whatever you put besides the snap code, you are overriding what that snap code loaded contract in Sabre is. So if it's not correct, you just overwrote correct information with incorrect information, and now you've got a debit memo. A couple of other things I want to point out here. Your passenger type. There was a time when it was very important to do at least neg. I know that was common at one point. And around the same time, there was a common situation where you would have to append a PV for the private fare in order for it to store correctly. Those days are probably long gone for everybody. That was a change to this pricing logic in Sabre that kind of made the format a little more sensitive. If you didn't use passenger type neg and append a PV, or one or the other, your negotiated contract might not price correctly. Sabre has since changed their logic again, and as far as I can tell, you should be able to do ADT, and you shouldn't need to append the PV anymore. So I would recommend, as a trailblazer or a Res 1 Plus champion, you probably want to validate that. I still see when people open tickets where I see some of these settings when I'm investigating the issue, I'll still see neg and I'll even see the PV selected, and I don't see that it's necessary. So it's only complicating things. I have seen where if you don't remove the PV, you're going to get an error message when you try to price it. So you're just adding more work by having to send the format twice because it said, well, you can't send it with the PV. So I definitely recommend at some point just doing some cleanup, change the passenger type to ADT, make sure the PV is not selected, unless, of course, there might be exceptions out there where you really do need it that way. So again, just to summarize a couple of the big points here, you should only have to use the snap code. And I recommend combining all the carriers that use the same snap code into one tab so you don't max out your 10 tabs when you can use one single tab for 15 or 20 or 25 different carriers. You should only need the snap code for all those carriers, and you should not have anything in the IT number or the endorsements, and even the OSI. Again, the OSI should go in the company level profile. If you do have a carrier that you think doesn't have the endorsement information or the tour code or IT number, whatever, filed correctly, open a Salesforce ticket so that the PRDS folks can make sure it's all loaded correctly. You shouldn't have to go to all these carriers and tell them that something's wrong. You should just be able to add the snap code and everything should price correctly regardless of the carrier. Don't use the PV unless you're absolutely sure you need it. And the passenger type, in all cases, I think today should be ADT, again, unless you're positive that you need something else such as neg. Backend is something else I want to mention before we get to the end of this tab. Sometimes United Perks Plus is a perfect example. They don't have a snap code. You don't get a front-end discount. You get a back-end discount. So if you don't use a snap code, this back-end option becomes available, and actually I should use a new tab just to illustrate. Okay, so we have what we're calling Perks Plus, and it's, say, United. No snap code. This is not a part of the front end. Let's say they have a front end discount, but it's the AMX12, so it's one of these carriers that you're using here. But for certain fares, they have the back end discount where you don't use the snap code. Instead, you use the Perks Plus number. The no commission, if for some reason you need to specify the commission amount 0, you can say it here, and when it stores the fare, it'll do the KP 0 in the pricing entry and store it in the PQ that way. But in regard to commissions, I would say that it is far more productive for you to not have to ever worry about the commission, because there should be commission tables for your business where you should never be at risk of having a commission issue. That should all be done on the back end, and you shouldn't have to worry about whether you need to add a commission or not. Basically, you want a commission specified in the stored fare, just select it here, but again, I don't think that should be needed. That's just another thing to maintain and possibly get wrong if it's not configured correctly. The minimum dollar amount, I don't know that anybody would use it anymore, but let's say that for one of these carriers, that the snap code would only be used if the published fare was at least a certain amount. So basically, you book a round trip, the fare is $200. You try to use the snap code, it's going to say your fare is too low. This fare is not eligible for your negotiated contract. I don't know that anybody has those anymore, but just in case you do, there's where you would configure it. And I'm going to stop right here because the next tab is going to take about a half an hour.